During the era of slavery, the enslaved primarily adopted Christianity, taking its message of freedom and equality to provide comfort and hope in the face of oppression. The enslaved incorporated their own traditional religion, which was a unique form of worship practiced in secret away from the watchful eye of the enslaver. This practice included spirituals with coded messages about liberation. The enslaved also saw the conversion to Christianity as a road to freedom. Before slavery, Africa was home to many religions, including Orisha, Islam, and Christianity. These religions were diverse and varied, but shared some commonalities. These commonalities were a belief in a supreme creator and lesser gods, a belief in ancestral spirits who are active in daily life, the belief in the power of the human voice and dance, and the tradition of blending elements of other cultures. Africans kept their religions alive through stories, songs, and other expressions. Many Africans resisted America's version of religion, questioning how could a God of love allow a master to be so evil? Many enslaved never accepted the white man's interpretation of the Bible, that God intended for them to be enslaved and viewed as a lesser people. Yet, many continued to adopt the message of Christianity because it was the only thing that offered them hope. The first African Baptist church in Savannah, Georgia, was one of the first black churches in America. It was formed in 1773 by George Lyell, a former slave who became a Baptist minister. The church was a place of community, built by the black community that provided a place of worship for the enslaved and freed black people. Ironically, today, the church is still one of the most segregated institutions in America. At some point, we should ask ourselves why that is. In this video, I recommend the book Slave Religion, The Invisible Institution in the Antebellum South by Albert Robideau. Education was restricted for the enslaved, and access to education was limited. White elites feared that literacy would undermine the institution of slavery. Although enslavers attempted to strip the enslaved of their identity, the enslaved still learned through untraditional means, such as family, underground schools, and storytelling. Learning to read was dangerous for the enslaved. They risked severe punishment, including physical abuse, imprisonment, and even death if they were caught. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that racial segregation was constitutional. The ruling was based on the idea of white supremacy and black inferiority. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation. These laws require black and white people to use separate facilities, schools, parks, and transportation. The African Free School in New York City was the first school in the United States for black students. It was founded in 1787 by Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and the New York Manumission Society. Cheyenne University of Pennsylvania was the first historically black college and university in the United States. It was founded in 1837 by Richard Humphrey. On a personal note, my mother sent my youngest sister and I to Lutheran school from kindergarten through the 3rd grade. From the 4th grade through graduating high school, she sent us to Catholic school. It was not until I attended Tennessee State University, a historically black college and university in Nashville, Tennessee, during my freshman year, that I was introduced not only to information about history, but definitely about black history that I would have never received if I had not attended a historically black college and university. Today, there are 107 historically black colleges and universities in the United States. That's something to be proud of. Ironically, recently, I was asked by a coworker, why do we have to have black schools and white schools? My response was, we should have never had to have them. However, the silver lining is, because we do have them, black history will not continue to be whitewashed. In this video, I recommend the book Self-Taught by Heather Andrea Williams to add to your Black History library. What if I told you that it was a group of ladies that changed the narrative, that totally reshaped the perspective of the Civil War? That's exactly what happened with The Lost Cause. The Lost Cause is a historical narrative developed by white Southerners after the Civil War. Its purpose, to declare that the Confederacy was noble. The South claims that the Confederate cause of the Civil War was to defend the Southern way of life. But let's be clear, the Southern way of life meant to continue chattel slavery and extend it into new territories. The narrative created consisted of three primary points. One, that the Confederate fight was heroic. We need to keep that in mind because we saw something similar here in our own lifetime. Two, that enslaved people were happy, as if they were in some form of benevolent relationship. And three, that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War. The lost cause was one of the world's most successful efforts at changing a narrative. The masterminds behind it all, the daughters of the Confederacy. The daughters of the Confederacy were social and political elites who used their leverage to spread the pro-version of the war, what they called the real history. It was the daughters of the Confederacy's primary responsibility for all of the memorials and statues of Confederate leaders and soldiers that you see spread out all throughout the South. Their ability to raise funds and to lobby positioned them to put pressure on local governments to erect Confederate statues in prominent public places like courthouses and capitals. They've even had a statue erected at the Arlington National Cemetery. They memorialized every space they deemed relevant to the Confederacy. Their efforts were prominent from after the Civil War well into the 20th century. Realizing that generation of men were dying off, they implemented another strategy to preserve their honor. Their next tool, textbooks. That strategy was to teach the future generation about the Civil War. It was a strategic, deliberate approach to shape how Southern children viewed the Civil War. For a standard, they used what's called a measuring rod for textbooks, written by Milford Rutherford, a pro-slavery author, and they had former Confederate generals on the review committee. These people instructed school boards to reject all books that didn't afford full justice to the South. They also had libraries deface books deemed not meeting up to their standard by stamping "unjust to the South" clearly on the cover. This standard was spread all throughout the South, and it was monitored closely to ensure that no Northern influence got anywhere near their classrooms. You can clearly see how the narrative was changed in the book History of Georgia, written in 1954. That book was utilized to teach junior high school for decades. A good book that I would recommend for your Black history library is Dixie Daughters by Dr. Karen Cox. When it comes to American history, were we educated or were we indoctrinated? I'd say a little bit of both. In our last video, we discussed the influence that the daughters of the Confederacy had on the Southern academic school system. To reiterate, they implemented the measuring rod for textbooks that was written by a pro-slavery author. And remember, it was Confederate generals that approved the curriculum. They also defaced all books in the Southern libraries that did not live up to the standards of granting full justice to the South. They did so by stamping "unjust to the South" clearly on the cover of the books. Unfortunately, this alteration from the truth migrated its way into the Northern academic school system as well. In order to expand their market, Northern publishers modified the content to reflect the lost cause narrative. The South controlled the adoption policies, therefore forcing the Northern textbook companies to adhere to Southern standards. Therefore, Northern textbooks began adopting the narrative that suggested that Confederate soldiers were fighting for states' rights, downplaying the gross inhumanity of chattel slavery and romanticizing the Confederate soldiers' willingness to die for the Southern way of life. By the 20th century, Northern publishing companies had fully adopted the narration of the lost cause, totally distorting the truth that the Civil War was about the South's desire to continue chattel slavery. When I was a young kid in grade school and high school, my mother sent us to private school with the desire of believing that we were going to get better education. Knowing what I know today and what we've just learned right here, at least when it comes to American history, were we, or should I ask, were we all educated or were we indoctrinated? Once again, the book that I recommend for your Black History Library is Dixie Daughters by Dr. Karen Cox. As I would travel the country and engage in conversation regarding civil rights, I would ask people from all walks of life if they could name the civil rights leaders that they were familiar with. For the most part, the elder generation, those who I would say of the baby boomer generation or older, would make mention of Dr. Martin Luther King. There would also be brief mentioning of Rosa Parks and Malcolm X. When it came to Generation X, the age group that was probably born around 1965 through 1980 still had similar responses. However, when I would speak to millennials, those born around 1981 or so or after, the responses got a little bit more vague, depending upon who I was talking to and to some degree where I was at in the country. Their responses appeared to have little to no knowledge of who our civil rights leaders were. Interesting enough, race was no longer a factor. It appeared that the further I got away from the South, like mentioned in our last video, the less knowledge individuals had of our past civil rights leaders. So let's just take a minute to name a few. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was an American social reformer and abolitionist. He became the most important leader for civil rights for African Americans during the 19th century. He became widely known for his "What does your 4th of July mean to us?" speech. W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was a co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. He was also an advocate for protest and challenging social norms. W.E.B. Du Bois also was the editor of a publication called The Crisis, a crisis put out by the NAACP that was highly relied upon by African Americans. Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was an investigative journalist, a socialist, an educator, and an early leader of the civil rights movement. She was also one of the co-founders of the NAACP. Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was the Mississippi State Field Secretary for the NAACP. He was also known for challenging the University of Mississippi for denying him the opportunity to attend law school there, even though the state of Mississippi did not have a law school for African Americans. He was also a very strong advocate for justice in the murder of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who was lynched by 2 white men for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Dorothy Height. Dorothy Height was the president of the National Council of Negro Women. She was a civil rights activist, and she was a women's rights activist. She focused on the issues pertaining to African American women, to include unemployment, literacy, and voter awareness. John Lewis. John Lewis was a civil rights activist and an American politician who served in the House of Representatives for the state of Georgia. He coined the phrase "good trouble" and was a pillar for social justice. John Lewis was also one of the leaders who staged the 1960 Nashville sit-in, the first mass sit-in of its kind. Of course, there are a number of names not mentioned in this video, but I encourage you to do a deeper dive into the commitment of these individuals to see why they were so committed to civil rights.